The cold wasn't just something you felt, it was something that invaded your very bones, a merciless predator stalking the mountain town we called home. When the blizzard rolled in that afternoon, heavy and sudden like a fist crashing into glass, it swallowed everything whole. The gray sky peeled away to reveal nothing but a thick, blinding wall of light, the wind cutting through the trees like shattered glass. I remember shivering uncontrollably as I helped Emily stack firewood against the back porch, the gusts tearing at my clothes, the snow already settling like frost on my eyelashes. I don't know if it was fear or pure instinct, but the small voice inside me whispered that this storm wasn't natural. By nightfall, the power lines snapped with sharp, brittle cracks, one after another like the last pulse of a dying heart. Our electricity disappeared without a warning, plunging us into darkness so complete it wasn't just black, it was a void you could almost drown in. The air inside our cabin thickened with the scent of frozen pine and damp wood, mingled with the fading echoes of happy everyday life now shattered by cold. I wrapped Emily's small body tightly in every blanket I could find and lit one flickering lantern that did little to hold back the abyss creeping through the window frames. Emily huddled close, her body trembling, lips blue and chapped from the sharp cold. "Mama," she whispered, voice wavering, "do you see them?" I didn't want to look, but my eyes kept drifting to the window where frost had patterned itself like ancient runes. There, in the swirling snow, I caught glimpses of pale shapes moving just beyond sight. Faces, not quite faces, smiling with teeth that glistened sharper than icicles. My skin crawled. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, that I was just exhausted and scared, but something inside me knew better. That night, the wind didn't just howl, it spoke. It carried voices, soft and hungry, brushing against the walls like dry leaves skittering across the floor. I lay awake, heart hammering as I imagined Emily's small fingers slipping from mine, drawn beyond the door into the blizzard's maw. I thought of the old legends Tom had whispered earlier about spirits riding the storm to steal the warmth from living souls. I wanted to laugh, to deny those stories. But when I looked at Emily's wide eyes in the dark, I knew all too well the truth that whispered in the cold. We weren't alone. The following day, Tom staggered through the deep powder to our cabin, frostbitten and wild-eyed. He told a story I didn't want to hear, of neighbors disappearing, of footprints etched into the snow like cruel trails leading to nowhere. "They're not animals," he said, pulling me close as the wind slammed the shutters. "They're creatures of ice and hunger. They don't just kill, they devour your heat, your life." That night, the shadows beyond the windows seemed alive. They lingered there, pressing against the glass with chilling smiles that stretched too wide for human mouths. Doors began to open themselves, and houses emptied beneath our watchful eyes. The townsfolk vanished one by one, leaving only icy mausoleums behind. The snow fell heavier with each passing hour, smothering every sound except for the faint, eerie scratching at our windows. It was a rhythm now, a calling, insistent and patient. I learned to bury my own breath beneath the blankets, still and silent, fearing that even the slightest warmth might draw them closer. On the fourth night, Emily disappeared. I woke to find her bed cold and empty, the bitter wind curling through the room like a living thing. Outside, the snow was fresh, deep, and untouched, except for one set of tiny footprints leading away toward the tree line. I followed, coatless and desperate, the sting of frost burning every exposed inch of skin. Through the blinding light, I saw them, dozen pale figures moving fluidly, faces tilted like curious statues with eyes that glowed soft and terrible in the night. Emily lay limp in their grasp, her breath shallow and slow. I raised an old rifle in shaking hands and fired. The gunshot was swallowed immediately by the storm's roar. The creatures turned slowly, eyes locked on mine, their voices rising like the wind itself in a crystalline hiss. You should have stayed cold. The cold wasn't just outside anymore. It had come for us inside, for life itself. I dragged Emily back to the cabin and smothered every spark of fire, wrapping her in cloths soaked with frozen air. We remained two fragile shadows in the vast white silence as the blizzard raged around us. Days passed before the storm relented, and when it did, the world that returned was a frozen graveyard of empty houses and shattered dreams. Emily woke slowly, fragile as new ice, but alive. The snow people were gone, no more than ghosts in the wind, for now. But the cold had tasted our warmth, and I knew deep in my marrow they would return with the next storm. And we would never truly be safe or warm again.
The heatwave had baked the city into a slow, suffocating oven. Even behind locked windows and drawn blinds, the air inside our small apartment hung heavy and thick like a wet blanket soaked in boiling water. I was slumped on the couch, shirt clinging to sweat-soaked skin, every breath feeling like it scraped my throat raw. The fan above spun lazily, creaking with what little air it could move, and Laura kept pacing, wiping damp strands of hair from her face. Every night felt endless, like we were trapped in a furnace that refused to cool. The news warned of rising crimes as desperation mounted, people driven past reason by the relentless, blistering sun. So when I heard the faint scrape against the front door, barely audible over the buzzing air conditioning unit's dying hum, my heart clenched. Laura froze mid-step, her eyes glancing toward the door like a predator sensing movement in the dark. The silence in the hallway was stifling, only the whispered crackle of the old doors wood against the frame answered. Something was out there. Something wrong. I moved slowly to the door, trying the knob, locked. I peeked through the peephole and saw nothing but a blur of heat waves. Then, a gloved hand obscured the small glass. My pulse hammered loud enough to drown the heavy silence. Laura grabbed my arm firmly, her grip sharp and steady. The handle rattled violently, the door shaking on its hinges. "Please, someone's out there," I whispered, wishing I could call the police. But recent reports said the lines were jammed, the city overwhelmed. We were alone. Without warning, the lock snapped and the door burst open. The man charged in, sweat pouring off his wild eyes, face flushed not just from heat but raw desperation. "Water. Food. Please," he gasped, voice ragged and cracked like a broken radio. "I'm dying out there." He stepped inside, the thick air around him shimmering unnaturally, like he carried the furnace with him. His movements were jittery but powerful, a storm barely restrained. Laura stepped forward, knife in hand, trying to steady her shaking voice. "You shouldn't be here." He laughed, a raw, broken sound. "You think I'm some villain?" His eyes were wild, but there was a madness in them that spoke of survival at any cost. "Try living in this heat. Sun cooking your skin off. No water. No mercy." I reached slowly for my phone, heart pounding in my ears, but he noticed and smiled cruelly as he lunged. Laura pushed me back behind the couch with a sharp command. The old iron skillet sat heavy on the coffee table. I grabbed it just as the man charged again. He was like fire and crackling static, violent and unpredictable. Laura was quick, slashing with her knife, but he was driven by desperation, flailing wildly with dangerous strength. The skillet connected with a heavy thunk, but he shrugged it off, eyes blazing with fury. Hot, wild, and ruthless, he was the heatwave made flesh. I stumbled backward, breath ragged, sweat mingling with fear. The air seemed to heat even more, shimmering as if charged with electric menace. The intruder's lips twisted into a mocking grin, his breath heavy and hot on my skin. The room felt like a cage shrinking with every pounding heartbeat. Laura didn't hesitate. She ducked low, slashing across his forearm. Blood welled quickly, stark against his sunburned skin. He stumbled, surprise flashing across his face before rage consumed it. He grabbed a shard from a broken vase, lunging. Laura twisted away, the knife flashing in the dull light. I shouted, grabbed a lamp from the side table, and swung with everything I had. The heavy metal cracked against his temple, sinking deep with a sickening wet sound. He dropped like a stone, eyes wide with shock, body crumpling onto the sticky floor. The silence that followed was heavier than the heat. Laura stood over him, breathing hard, sweat pouring down her face, knife still clenched in trembling fingers. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, feeling the tension leave her body in quivering waves. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, voice breaking but resolute. "Not during this damned heat." Outside, the sun still beat down mercilessly. The city burned as if it would never cool again. But inside, in that tiny apartment suffused with sweat and fear, Laura was the fire that burned away the shadow and saved us both. Even in the silence, I could feel the heat lurking, waiting. The madness of the sun was not done with us yet. But for tonight, the home was ours. And she was our shield.
I tasted copper before I even heard the first drop. That metallic tang lingered in the back of my throat like a ghost of something terrible yet to come. It was just after dusk when the sky cracked open with thunder bruised purple and black, and the rain began to fall, blood red and steady, like the heavens themselves were bleeding. I pressed my palm to the cold glass of our kitchen window, watching terrified as the crimson droplets pooled and spread with impossible speed across the sidewalk and lawns like rivers of fresh wounds. Noah was curled up on my lap, his small body trembling against mine. His skin was hot, cheeks flushed with fever, and his wide eyes darted nervously to the window. "Mom," he whispered, "they're calling." I swallowed hard, trying to force down a swell of panic rising like bile. The scent of iron filled the air, thick and choking, but beyond that, there was something rotten, some mold, festering evil drifting on the wind beneath the storm's drip. Pastor Raymond was quick to claim it was a divine punishment, a reckoning for forgotten sins. His booming voice echoed through the shattered town square, carrying words of fire and brimstone that fell like flakes against the relentless storm. But the rain wasn't holy. I watched it burn the edges of my kitchen table where it splattered like acid. The scent of burning flesh teased the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling the sky was bleeding for darker reasons. Our neighbor's screams rent the night before dawn, a nightmare twisted into sound. His skin blistered and bubbled like burning tar, eyes rolling back as if something viscous and hungry had swallowed his soul whole. We pressed wet cloths to his arms, but the flesh melted beneath our fingertips. Terror gripped the town like a vice, crushing every hope we tried to cling to. Noah's fingers twitched in my grasp, a small body fighting the fever, fighting the call of the blood rain. Caleb, the science teacher, arrived at our door late into the storm's second day, his face pale and tight with strain. He clutched a small jar filled with thick, crimson liquid, the rain itself trapped, alive and writhing in madness. He muttered fragmented phrases, parasites, alien life forms, a viral invasion carried in the droplets from a sky going mad. I wanted to scream, to pull Noah into the storm's shelter, but I was frozen under the weight of impending doom. Inside, the house smelled of antiseptic and fear, and I could hear the quiet muttering of voices outside behind the storm's relentless drum. The infected were wandering like specters, their skin cracked and raw, their murmurs twisted into obscene prayers I couldn't understand. Pastor Raymond's sermons grew darker as the infected multiplied, and he urged the pure to cast out those touched by the rain, a haunting, cruel cleansing to stop the spread that only seemed to feed the horror. I never believed I'd have to fight my neighbors. But every glance carried suspicion, every whispered prayer carried fear, and soon mobs formed in the streets. The rain hammered down, washing the world red as people turned on each other, desperate to survive in the chaos. I kept Noah close, wrapping bandages soaked in cool water around his arms, trying to shield him from the madness that crept closer each day. The third night was the worst. Voices rose on the wind, fragmented and wailing like lost souls caught in the storm's crimson fingers. I could hear them outside, twisted voices calling Noah's name, urging him to leave me and step into the burning rain. My fists shook, and tears blurred my vision as I held him tighter, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. The rain fell harder, thick with whispers that clawed at my mind, promising warmth in the cold madness. Neighbors began disappearing, dragged into the shadows by hands too slick, too cold to be human. Each morning brought new corpses, their bodies twisted and marked by the stain of the blood rain. Caleb returned with somber eyes, telling us the infection was unlike anything on this earth, that the rain carried a darkness deeper and older than the soil beneath our feet. It was a curse, a plague, or something worse, a herald of the end. Fear became a living thing, pulsing beneath our skin, guiding us into desperate acts. There were no heroes here, only survivors clinging to frayed threads of hope. I fortified the house as best I could with holy water and salt, but the line between sanctuary and prison grew thinner by the hour. The air inside was thick with damp, the smell of sweat and sickness curling in every corner. One night, Noah awoke screaming, words strangled and jumbled. "They want me," he gasped, eyes wild with fever and visions. I tried to soothe him, to plead with the storm, to bargain with whatever hungered beyond the red veil, but the rain crept under the door, warm and sticky, burning away all my defenses. As dawn cracked bloodshot and raw, the blood rain finally ceased. Silence followed, thick and terrible, an uneasy lull across broken earth and shattered lives. The survivors emerged, gaunt and haunted, their scars raw beneath bruised flesh. Noah was weak, but his eyes held a clarity that belied the horror he'd survived. Caleb warned us the storm was not finished. The scarlet clouds still gathered beyond the horizon, and the same ancient menace stirred in their depths. I stared out at the broken world through tear-lined eyes, clutching Noah to my chest, promising to protect him against whatever came next. The rain may have stopped for now, but its echo lingers, for when it returns, there may be no place left to hide.
The storms began as a whispered warning on the wind, faint and almost musical. At first, no one paid much attention, just more thunder rolling over our small town nestled in folds of forest and fields. But soon those storms, fierce and erratic, carved the sky with jagged lightning bolts that struck with unsettling precision. Trees were snapped like twigs, barns shattered, and frighteningly, people began to vanish under violent flashes. I knew the storms better than most. I was born and raised here, listening to every crack of thunder that echoed over the hills, a town full of old superstitions and older secrets. The whispers started about old Ben, the bent and silent man who lived alone in the ridge house, always humming a strange tune that seemed out of place and time. Folks said his humming carried on the wind just before the skies tore open. One summer night, I heard it myself, the eerie, lilting hum drifting faint and haunting from Ben's house just before the first lightning bolt split the sky with a deafening roar. The next morning, the town was shattered. A lightning strike had burned the church steeple, and my friend's farm lay in ruins. People looked scared, blame circled like a vulture. Curiosity and dread drove me to the ridge the following evening. As Ben hummed quietly on his porch, his voice a fragile thread against the storm's growing fury, I felt the air charge and buzz around us. I saw lightning crackling, drawing closer, as if summoned. I stumbled back but could do nothing against the old tune weaving through the tempest. The power was odd, a pulse that vibrated in the very earth and air. I began to suspect Ben wasn't just an old man humming to kill time. He was calling the storms, deliberately or trapped by some force beyond his control. I needed answers. I took refuge in the town library as the next storm rolled in, a battered building smelling of musty paper and dust. Among the forgotten stacks, behind brittle shelves, I found an ancient leather-bound book, its title faded but unmistakable, a ritual ledger, a history of weather magic and ancient bindings. The pages spoke of a pact made long ago. A man bound the wild lightning to his family's blood with song, holding chaotic forces at bay. Ben's humming was no idle tune. It was a chain, a song of binding and control. Without it, the storm would rage free, devastating, untethered, and wild. The more he hummed, the storm obeyed, carrying both protection and terror. The ritual was fragile, a fragile balance held by melody and will. The book's instructions were precise. Only by reversing the song, speaking the counter melody under the storm's eye, could a town free itself from the stormcaller's curse. It warned of danger. The song was old, dark, unyielding. Mistakes would anger the storm, might cost lives. That night, cloaked in rain and trembling under blackened skies, I climbed to Ben's porch, the page's words rolling through my mind. I found him silent now, worn and tired. His eyes held sorrow and warning. Before I could speak, a bolt lit the sky, striking near, sending splinters and fire roaring. Heart pounding, I began to hum the counter song, hesitant notes trembling through the storm's howl. The lightning snapped erratically, the wind screaming in protest. Ben joined, weak at first, then stronger, a duet of ancient voices rising against the tempest's rage. The storm shuddered, thunder warbling and dipping. The sky unspooled like worn tapestry, and with a final clash, silence fell. The air cold, the ground still soaked but calm, the storm's grip shattered. For the first time in years, the town breathed and saw clear skies. Days passed. The sky stayed gentle, the threat lifted. Ben's house stood quiet, his humming silenced but his eyes lighter now, freed from whatever held him prisoner. I kept the ancient book, knowing the song might call again, but for now, the storm was laid to rest, bound by melody, broken by courage. The nights grew quieter after that, but I couldn't shake the memory of Ben's voice fading into the storm's rage. The weight of the song's power pressed heavy on my chest, a reminder that nature's fury was only kept trapped by fragile threads of human will. I spent long evenings poring over the book, learning the words, the melodies, afraid but determined. Every crack of distant thunder felt like a test, a whisper from the skies to remind us all that power, once unleashed, was never easily caged. The townfolk began to breathe easier, but I caught the flicker of fear in their eyes when clouds trod near, an old, ingrained terror reborn with every storm's approach. One afternoon, while walking past Ben's empty porch, I thought I heard that faint hum again, trembling on the wind like a half-forgotten song. I stopped, heart hammering, but there was only silence and the distant roll of thunder. I wondered if the burden of the stormcaller had passed, or if another voice would rise to take its place. The ritual had saved us, but it was clear the chains were never permanent. The storm's song was old and hungry, and I feared one day the sky would call again, and no one would be ready.
I always loved the way the wind sounded when it blew through the fields near our house. It wasn't just the rush of air, it was like the earth was whispering secrets to the sky. Mama used to say the wind carried stories from faraway places, But sometimes, when the wind got too loud and the sky turned dark and heavy, I knew something was wrong. It started last spring, just around when the flowers began to bloom. The storms came out of nowhere, faster and angrier than before. The sirens wailed like broken cries, and neighbor boys and girls clutched each other tight. My daddy told me to stay close and not look at the sky too long, but I couldn't help it. The clouds were huge and rolling, black as burnt velvet, and they made the whole world feel small. Mama said the tornadoes were like wild horses, riding the wind and galloping across the fields. But I heard the whisper too. A soft sound, almost like singing, that came before the big storms, a smooth, sad tune that made my skin crawl. I asked Daddy where it came from, and he looked at me strange, his face all tight with worry. "That's the shepherd song," he said quietly, "and it means the storms are coming." I didn't understand then. How could a song make a tornado? The first time I heard the whistle, a sharp, whiny sound floating over the cornfields, I was hiding under the porch with my little sister, watching the sky melt into gray and fire. Daddy said it was the shepherd, some old ghost or spirit, they weren't sure. It was supposed to protect us, to keep the worst at bay. But the tornado that day tore through the town like it was mad, flattening everything in its path. I remember hiding in the cellar, the walls shaking, the wind screaming like thunder sent to rip us apart. The whistle sounded again, higher this time, and through the cracks in the door, I saw the swirling sky turn brighter, like it recognized the sound. Mama held our hands tight, but I felt her fingers trembling. After the storm, everything smelled like wet dirt and broken dreams. Daddy took me to the fields, where the tall stalks lay crushed and broken like fallen soldiers. I told him about the whisper, the song. He didn't answer at first, but finally nodded slowly. "The shepherd leads them," he said. "But sometimes, the storms get too wild for even him." The tornadoes kept coming every few weeks, winding through our town with terrible footsteps. Some nights, I would hear the shepherd's whistle far off in the distance, carried on the wind like a cold breath. It wasn't scary then, it was sad, like a lullaby for lost things. But I noticed something, the tornadoes were never random. They seemed to follow a path, a circle around the ridge and farmland. Daddy said it was the shepherd guiding the storms, herding them like sheep. But the stories also said the shepherd was cursed, trapped to walk forever with the storms, unable to rest. One evening, the sky darkened early, and the sirens screamed louder than ever. Mama packed a bag, and we ran for the cellar as the wind tossed trees like toys. I held my sister's hand tight and tried to stay brave. The whistle began faint, then stronger, cutting through the roar of the storm like a lonely song. I peeked through a crack in the wooden door, and in the eye of the tornado, I saw him, the shepherd. He was tall and thin, wrapped in rags that fluttered like broken flags. His face was shadowed, but his eyes burned with a hunger and sadness that made my stomach twist. He raised a crooked hand and blew his whistle once more. The storm seemed to obey his every breath, twisting tighter around him, the lost souls trapped inside crying out in the wind. I heard them calling names, begging, howling. It was like watching a terrible prison spun from wind and fury. Daddy kissed my forehead and told me to stay away from the storm's eye, but I wanted to help. I wanted the shepherd to know we weren't afraid, that we wanted the lost to be free. That night, I dreamed I was flying inside the tornado with the shepherd, that he whispered the names of everyone lost in the storm, one by one. I felt the anger and sadness swirl around me, and I cried because the storm was so big, and the shepherd was so lonely. The tornado finally passed, leaving behind silence and broken homes. In the days that followed, I listened to the wind, hoping to hear the whistle again, but it was quiet. Too quiet. Mama said sometimes peace was just waiting for the next storm, and that the shepherd's burden was never ending. He carries the wind so the storms don't carry us, she said, holding me close. I didn't understand all of it then, but I knew the storms were a part of us, like the land and the sky and the growing wheat. And that sometimes, the bravest thing was to listen to the wind's lonely song. I still hear it sometimes, far off and faint, drifting with the rustling leaves. The shepherd is still out there, whistling on the wind, carrying the storms and the lost, and protecting us, if only for a little while.